October 8, 1945, Amarillo, Texas. Special Agent Thomas Crawford stepped off the Santa Fe railway line, carrying a leather briefcase and orders from Washington that felt heavier than they should. 3 German women prisoners were pregnant. The fathers were American civilians, cowboys, ranch hands, men who'd been tasked with guarding enemies of the state. Somewhere between barbed wire and wide horizons, fraternization had crossed into something the government couldn't ignore. If you're enjoying this story, like and subscribe to stay connected with history's most compelling untold stories. Comment where you're watching from. We always love hearing from our community around the world. Now, let's step back into that October morning when Crawford adjusted his Stetson against the Panhandle wind and wondered how you investigate love in a place where the rules of war had dissolved into dust and distance. He didn't know it yet, but the answers he'd find would challenge everything Washington assumed about enemies, prisoners, and the messy humanity that refuses to follow regulations. Crawford had spent 3 years hunting saboteurs along the Gulf Coast, tracking German agents in Houston, profiteers who sold military supplies to the highest bidder. He'd interrogated spies, broken black market rings, filed reports that sent men to federal prison. This assignment was different. No one was accusing these women of espionage. No one suggested the Cowboys were enemy collaborators. But laws had been broken, regulations designed to prevent exactly this kind of complication. As his government sedan rolled south toward Hereford through landscape that stretched endless in all directions, Crawford reviewed the files Dr. Margaret Walsh had compiled. 3 women, 3 separate ranch assignments, 3 American men who would need to be identified, questioned, and possibly charged. The War Department's initial report had been clinical: prisoner fraternization, violation of federal custody protocols, potential security breach, but the phrase that kept drawing Crawford's attention was buried in Dr. Walsh's medical notes. Patient appears well-nourished, shows no signs of physical coercion or distress. He'd investigated enough assault cases to recognize the euphemism. These weren't victims. That should have simplified things. Instead, it complicated everything. The Hereford Internment Processing Center, sprawled across former fairgrounds, a collection of temporary structures housing the final wave of German prisoners awaiting repatriation. Most of the 375,000 POWs brought to America between 1942 and 1946 had already gone home. What remained were complicated cases. Women mostly. Auxiliary personnel who'd worked as telephone operators, clerks, nurses, non-combatants who'd surrendered when the regime collapsed. They weren't soldiers. They'd never fired weapons. Most had opposed the regime quietly, survived the bombing campaigns, lost families in the chaos of Germany's final months. Now they waited in Texas heat, caught between a destroyed homeland and an uncertain future. Dr. Walsh met Crawford in her office, a room smelling of antiseptic and old coffee. At 47, she was experienced enough to recognize when protocol collided with basic humanity. She had served as a military physician in the First War and knew what happened when regulations tried to simplify people who could not be simplified. The files spread across her desk held more than medical charts. They held stories. Elise Hartmann, 23, from Stuttgart, a telephone operator whose parents and brother were killed in the February 1945 bombing raids. Anna Becker, 26, from Bremen, a shipping clerk whose husband died during the chaotic retreat, likely friendly fire. Katharina Vogel, 21, from Berlin, a hospital nurse with no listed family and a note. Witnessed significant trauma during final offensive. These women have been through hell, Agent Crawford Walsh said. Crawford answered, "The law on fraternization is clear. I still need names." The silence that followed held a challenge. Dr. Walsh pulled out another file. 3 ranch assignments through the Agricultural Labor Program, the McKenzie Ranch, the Harrison Spread, the Callahan property, small operations, family-owned, isolated by miles of panhandle grassland. She slid the file across the desk. "You'll find your answers there, Agent Crawford. Whether you'll find crimes is another matter entirely." The McKenzie Ranch sat 12 miles southwest, accessible only by unpaved county roads that turned to soup when it rained. Crawford found Sam McKenzie replacing a rotted fence post, his movements efficient with decades of practice. He was 34, too essential to ranch operations to have been drafted, running land inherited when his father died. He'd grown up memorizing every draw and creek bed, knew where water pooled after storms, where cattle sheltered from blue. When Crawford showed his credentials, McKenzie set down his post-hole digger without surprise. "I figured someone would come eventually," he said. "My wife should hear this too." Martha McKenzie poured coffee in a kitchen that held the accumulated warmth of 1,000 family meals. She was 31, a former schoolteacher who'd given up her position when they married not from pressure, but from choice. She loved teaching, but she loved this life more. She knew why Crawford was here. They all did. Small towns kept few secrets, and pregnancy was impossible to hide. They sat at a wooden table, scarred from decades of use, 3 people about to have a conversation that would determine whether anyone faced federal charges. "I'm investigating the pregnancy of Elise Hartman," Crawford began, pulling out his notebook. "I need to understand the circumstances." Sam and Martha exchanged glances that held entire conversations. Sam spoke first. "Elise came to us in April through the labor program. She was supposed to help Martha with cooking, cleaning, maybe garden work. The program said we'd be assigned enemy labor, that we should maintain distance, treat them as prisoners." He paused. "For about a week, we tried. Then we realized she wasn't an enemy. She was a scared young woman who'd lost everything." Martha leaned forward. "Her family died in the Stuttgart bombing, Agent Crawford, all of them. She had nowhere to go, no one waiting for her in Germany. We started treating her like a person. She ate at our table, slept in our guest room. We paid her a small wage from our own money. Not much, but enough for personal items." Her voice carried quiet defiance. "She became our friend." Crawford directed his next question at Martha, watching for reaction. "When did the relationship with your husband begin?" Martha didn't flinch. The directness of the question deserved directness in return. "Sam and I have been married 11 years. We can't have children, something medical, after I had scarlet fever as a girl. Elise knew this. We talked about it one evening. All 3 of us. She was lonely. We were lonely in different ways. What developed wasn't planned. The admission hung in the air like morning mist." Crawford had interviewed hundreds of witnesses, developed instincts for lies and half-truths. These people weren't lying. Sam met his gaze directly. "I'm saying Elise and I developed feelings for each other with Martha's knowledge and eventually her blessing. Martha and I love each other, but we also came to care for Elise. What happened between us wasn't about war or prisoners or breaking rules. It was about 3 people finding something they needed." Crawford wrote carefully, the scratch of his pen the only sound. "Where is Miss Hartman now?" "At the processing center," Martha said. "But she'll be back. We've applied for sponsorship to keep her in the country. Once the baby is born, we plan to raise the child together." All 3 of us, Crawford closed his notebook. "You understand this violates federal regulations, Mr. McKenzie. You could face criminal charges. Sam nodded. I understand, but I don't regret it. Neither does Martha. Neither does Elise. The Harrison spread was larger, nearly 3,000 acres running cattle and winter wheat. Crawford found Robert Harrison in the equipment barn, wrestling with a tractor that had thrown a belt. He was 41, a widower whose wife had died from pneumonia 3 years earlier during a particularly brutal winter. His son was somewhere in the Pacific with the Marine Corps, hadn't written in months, might be dead for all Harrison knew. He saw Crawford approaching and straightened, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He'd been expecting this visit. The town was small enough that news traveled faster than government sedans. They walked to the house in silence. Inside, Harrison poured whiskey into 2 glasses, without asking if Crawford wanted any. They sat in a living room, still marked by a woman's touch, curtains his wife had sewn. Old photographs, a quilt she'd worked on for years. Anna Becker, Crawford began. Harrison drank. She came in May to help with cooking. Quiet at first. Wouldn't look me in the eye. Moved like she expected to be hit. He stared into his glass. Her husband died in the retreat. Maybe friendly fire. She was 26, already a widow, no children, no family. He paused. When my wife Catherine died, I thought I'd never feel anything again. Then Anna arrived, and the house didn't feel empty. When did the relationship become intimate? Crawford asked. July, Harrison said. Heat wave. She had a nightmare, woke up screaming. I checked on her. She cried, apologizing, seeing her husband's face. I held her. After that, things changed. Did you understand this was illegal? Crawford asked. Harrison's tone sharpened. I followed rules my whole life. Anna wasn't my prisoner. She'd lost everything, same as me. What we found was survival. I'll marry her if she'll have me. The baby will have my name. The Callahan Ranch was next. Brothers Daniel, 38, for a heart murmur, and Michael, 35, partially deaf, met Crawford at the gate. You're here about Katharina, Daniel said. Crawford asked who the father was. Silence. Then Michael, we don't know. Doesn't matter to us. Daniel explained. She came in June. Former nurse, nightmares for a month. Michael and I aren't married. Maybe never will be. We work this ranch, live together, share everything. She needed people who wouldn't judge her, Michael added. Families don't always look like the government thinks. They'd filed sponsorship papers. We're building something, Daniel said at the processing center. Crawford interviewed the women. Elise Hartman sat across from him, hands on her stomach. Sam and Martha were kind from the start. She said, they treated me like I mattered. When did it become romantic? June. Sam and I connected over what we'd lost. Martha had seen it coming. She said she wasn't angry. Were you coerced? Crawford asked. No, Elise said steadily. I chose to stay. I chose Sam, and I accepted Martha's generosity. Anna Becker's interview followed a similar pattern. She was more guarded initially, her English less fluent, but her story aligned with Harrison's account. She'd been broken by loss, had found unexpected comfort in a widower who understood grief, had chosen to build something new from ruins. I know rules were broken, Anna said, through occasional pauses to find the right English words, but I don't regret it. Robert gave me a reason to imagine a future. Before him, I thought I would return to Germany and simply exist until I died. Now I'm carrying a child who will grow up in America. Katharina Vogel's interview was the most difficult. She was the youngest of the 3, and the war had marked her in ways that wouldn't heal for years. She'd seen things in the military hospital that had traumatized her wounded soldiers, screaming through morphine shortages. Civilians caught in crossfire, the consequences of a regime that had sent millions to their deaths. She spoke haltingly about the nightmares, about the guilt she carried for having been part of the system, even in a minor role. "Daniel and Michael didn't judge me," she said, her hands trembling slightly. "They didn't ask me to justify my past or explain myself. They just accepted that I was damaged and needed time to heal." Her voice dropped. What developed between us happened slowly. It wasn't planned. It was three broken people finding a way to be less broken together. Crawford asked gently, "Do you know which of them is the father?" Katharina shook her head. "Does it matter? The child will have two fathers who want to be responsible. That's more than many children have." Crawford spent his evenings at the local diner, eating chicken fried steak and listening to conversations swirl around him. The scandal, if it could be called that, was discussed openly. Opinions varied. Some residents were scandalized. The German women were enemies, prisoners who should have been kept at arm's length until repatriation. The men who'd gotten involved with them had violated the natural order, betrayed their country by consorting with the opposition. But others saw it differently. "These women weren't soldiers," one farmer told Crawford over coffee at the counter. "They were clerks and nurses, most of them opposed to the regime as we were. The men who took them in gave them kindness when they needed it most. Nothing wrong with that." A woman named Dorothy, whose son had died at Normandy, offered the most surprising perspective. "My boy wrote letters about German prisoners he guarded in France," she told Crawford. Her coffee cup cradled in weathered hands. "He said most were just scared kids who wanted to go home. He said we were all human underneath the uniforms." If he could see that while the fighting was still going on, I figure I can see it now. Those women suffered too. If they found some happiness here, I'm not going to condemn them for it. Crawford listened to these conversations with growing uncertainty. The law was clear: fraternization between prisoners and civilians was prohibited. But the purpose of that law was to prevent exploitation, coercion, security breaches. What he'd found in Hereford was none of those things. He'd found complicated human connections formed in the aftermath of catastrophic violence. He'd found people who'd chosen each other when they had every reason not to. Crawford's report took 3 days to write. He worked through draft after draft, balancing legal obligations with the human reality. The facts were clear. 3 German women prisoners had become pregnant by American civilian men in positions of authority, violating regulations. Yet the context revealed no coercion or exploitation, just women who'd lost everything finding unexpected connection in a difficult time. He wrote, "Investigation confirms that 3 German female prisoners became pregnant while assigned to civilian ranch work near Hereford, Texas. Interviews established relationships between prisoners and civilian supervisors. Violating federal regulations, however, no evidence of coercion, exploitation, or security breaches was found. All women entered relationships willingly, and all civilian men acknowledge paternity and intend to support the women and children. Medical exams confirm no mistreatment," he continued. "The circumstances are unusual. These women were not combat prisoners, but auxiliary personnel who surrendered voluntarily. Their assignments placed them in isolated domestic settings, where normal human interaction was inevitable. The emotional bonds formed naturally due to their traumatic experiences and uncertain futures. Recommendation: while technical violations occurred, prosecution would serve no clear purpose. The women posed no security threat. The men acted without malicious intent. Recommend administrative sanctions, not criminal charges, with revised protocols for future prisoner work assignments." Crawford sealed the report and walked to the post office. Reflecting on the small town that had become unexpectedly complicated, He realized that sometimes the law was to blunt an instrument to address human need, and the best investigators recognized the difference between violation and humanity. Crawford's recommendation was accepted. Washington had no interest in prosecuting men for falling in love with former enemies. The war was over, and public attention had shifted. Administrative sanctions were imposed, including reprimands and fines, and the ranches were removed from the approved list for prisoner labor. The women's cases were handled individually. Elise Hartman, Anna Becker, and Katharina Vogel were granted residency permits based on their pregnancies and American citizen children. They would stay, build lives, and raise children who would never fully understand the war that brought their parents together. Elise's daughter was born in February 1946. The Mackenzies raised Catherine together. With Martha holding Elise's hand through the delivery, Anna Becker married Robert Harrison in March 1946, and their son, William Robert Harrison, was born 2 months later. Anna adapted to American life while maintaining her German heritage. Katharina Vogel's son, James, was born in April 1946. Daniel and Michael Callahan both signed the birth certificate as guardians, an arrangement that confused the county clerk's office but eventually became normal. Crawford returned to Hereford in 1952 and saw the thriving ranches the families he had investigated had found their place. The violations of regulations had faded into acceptance, and the families were living proof that sometimes human connection transcended legal boundaries. The German POW program brought 375,000 prisoners to U.S. camps during World War II, including 10,000 women who worked as auxiliary personnel. Most were repatriated, but some, like those in Hereford, formed relationships, bore children, and chose to stay. In 1945, the War Department revised its protocols, recognizing that isolated assignments could foster fraternization. For those who stayed, the regulations no longer mattered. They had found each other in the wreckage of war and built families out of enmity. Thomas Crawford retired in 1968. In his files is a letter from Elise Hartman Mackenzie, thanking him for recognizing that sometimes love defied the rules. The descendants of those unlikely unions live throughout Texas, proving that in war's darkest aftermath, there is always room for connection and love.